My cousin Louis disappeared on Boxing Day in 2002 while we were playing Sardines in my grandparents' attic. We searched for him for weeks. The police searched for him for months. He was never found. 22 years later, I returned to that house. I wish I hadn't, because I think I found something I shouldn't have had, and I don't think the game ever ended. I grew up in a narrow Victorian terrace in the suburbs of York. 3 stories of damp plaster, drafty windows and floorboards that complained every time you stepped on them. It was a loud house. You always knew where everyone was. You could hear Mum humming in the scullery, the television in the sitting room, or the distinct rattle of the biscuit tin lid from all the way up on the first floor landing. But every Christmas, when my cousins came to stay, the house belonged to Louis. He was 11, I was 13. Louis had this impossible talent for turning ordinary things into events. A freezing Yorkshire rainstorm became an expedition. A sudden winter blackout became a theatre for ghost stories. He was loud, fast, and possessed a brilliant, almost cruel imagination. He also invented rules for every game we played, but his absolute favorite, the game he treated with a sort of religious devotion, was Sardines. If you've never played it, Sardines is the inversion of hide and seek. Only one person hides. Everyone else searches independently. When you find the hidden person, you don't call them out. You squeeze into the hiding place with them, holding your breath in the dark. Eventually, the hiding spot becomes a suffocating pocket of limbs, everyone packed together like sardines in a tin. Louis loved it because he loved watching the panic set in for the last person left searching, the realization that everyone else has vanished, and somewhere in the dark, a crowd of people is watching you in total silence. The year he disappeared, we were staying at my grandparents' house for Boxing Day. It was a labyrinth of half flights of stairs and converted pantries. But there was one room nobody used. At the very top of the house, at the end of the attic landing, sat a tiny servant's room. The door was solid oak, painted appealing white, and always locked with a heavy brass padlock. Grandad told us the floorboards inside were rotted through. Louis told me that was exactly what someone hiding treasure would say. He used to stand on that landing, staring at the padlock, his eyes wide and calculating. That evening, a winter storm took out the local power grid. The house plunged into total, pitch-black silence. Out came the torches. In the flickering yellow light, Louis's face lit up with that familiar grin. He jumped to his feet, casting a massive, distorted shadow against the wallpaper, and shouted, "Sardines!" The rules were set instantly by Louis. Torches could only be clicked on for 3 seconds at a time to check a room. No hiding in the cellar. And if you found the hidden person, you had to enter their space without making a sound. Louis, naturally, volunteered to hide first. We heard his trainers slapping against the stairs, the sound rapidly ascending through the floors of the house until it faded somewhere near the top. I stood by the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down from 60. The tick of the clock felt heavier in the dark, competing with the rattling of the sash windows. 58, 59, 60. The search began. At first it was the usual chaotic fun. My cousins and I moved through the middle floors like a small, stumbling army, our torch beams cutting through the dark, catching the edges of wardrobes and dropping behind sofas. We checked the airing cupboard. We checked the space behind the heavy velvet curtains in the dining room. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The house grew freezing cold as the heating died, the dampness of the Yorkshire winter seeping through the brickwork. The playful shouting between us slowly died down. Nobody had found him. By the 30-minute mark, the mood turned sour. My aunt and uncle got involved, their voices taking on the sharp, clipped edge of genuine irritation. "Louis, come on now, the joke's over. It's freezing." Nothing. No muffled giggles from a wardrobe. No sound of floorboards shifting above. The family spread out systematically. Mum and Aunt Sarah took the ground floor, checking the coal bunker and the pantry. Grandad took a heavy lamp and went out into the frozen lane to see if the lad had slipped out the back door as a prank. I went up to the attic alone. The top floor carried a sharp, dry scent of old newsprint and cold slate tiles. My torch beam bounced off the exposed beams of the ceiling. I walked down the narrow landing toward the back room, and that's when I noticed it. The heavy brass padlock on the servants' room door was dangling open. It was hanging loosely from the hasp, unclasped. The solid oak door was standing ajar. Just 3 inches of absolute velvety blackness showed through the gap. I felt a profound sense of irritation. Lewis had clearly spent the last week finding where Grandad hid the key. He'd risked breaking his neck through the floorboards just to win a silly game on Boxing Day. "I've got you," I whispered, stepping up to the door. "Move over." I pushed the door open. The hinges were completely silent. I clicked my torch on. The room was entirely empty. There were no rotted floorboards. There was no treasure. There was nothing but a tiny, square space, 4 walls of bare, unpainted plaster, and a floor covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of gray dust. Except right in the center of that dust sat Lewis's torch. It was turned on. Its beam was pointed directly at the far wall, casting a weak, fading circle of light against the plaster. But Lewis wasn't there. There were no footprints in the dust leading into the room. There was only the solitary track of my own boots by the threshold. He was never seen again. The police response was massive. Because it was a child, and because it was winter, they treated it with terrifying urgency. They brought in search dogs that sniffed Lewis's clothes, ran up to the attic landing, and then simply sat down at the threshold of the servants' room, whining. They brought in thermal imaging cameras, thinking he'd crawled into the wall cavities or under the floor insulation. The building inspectors came out. They tore up the floorboards of that top room, measured the gaps between the joists, checked the chimney breasts. There was no secret passage, no hidden drop, no way out, no explanation. The family didn't survive it. You don't survive an impossible loss like that. You just break into smaller pieces. My aunt and uncle moved to the south coast, unable to look at a brick terrace without seeing a tomb. Grandad stopped speaking entirely, spending his days sitting by the cold hearth, staring at his hands until he died 3 years later. Last autumn, my grandmother passed away in an assisted living facility. As the only grandson left in Yorkshire, the task of clearing out the terrace fell entirely to me. I hadn't set foot in that house in 22 years. When I turned the key in the front door, the wood resisted, swollen from years of damp and neglect. When the door finally gave way, it opened with a heavy, shuddering groan that echoed up the empty stairwell. The house looked smaller, decaying, but the attic landing felt exactly the same. The air up there was still freezing, carrying that same sharp mineral scent of dust and cold slate. The servants' room door was shut, the old brass padlock hanging loosely where the police had left it 2 decades ago. I spent the first 2 days packing boxes. Junk, decades of accumulated life that suddenly meant nothing. Old porcelain tea sets, bundles of letters tied with rotting twine, manuals for appliances that had been scrap metal since the 90s. I worked late. By 11 o'clock on the second night, the silence of the neighborhood was absolute. The fog rolled off the river and deadened every sound outside. I laid out a sleeping bag on the mattress in the first-floor bedroom. I had my headphones in, playing a podcast at high volume, specifically to drown out the natural shifting of the old timber frame. But around 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up with a start. My phone battery had drained to 0. The headphones were dead. And in that raw, unbuffered silence, I heard it. It was a sound coming from directly above my head, from the attic. It wasn't the groan of a house settling. It wasn't a bird on the roof tiles. It was the distinct rhythmic sound of small bare feet padding across floorboards. Step, step, step. Then a low, wet whisper came down the chimney breast, vibrating through the brickwork right next to my ear. It was the voices of children, their tones hushed, bubbling with that distinct, suppressed excitement of a game that shouldn't be caught. Shh, he's going to hear you. A short, sharp giggle followed. Move over. There's room for one more. Squeeze in. I lay perfectly still on that mattress, my heart hammering so hard against my ribs, I was certain whatever was upstairs could hear the thudding. The voice that had told the others to move over had the exact, confident cadence of my cousin Louis. The next morning, I forced myself to walk up to the attic landing. I needed to prove to myself that my brain was just playing tricks. But when I reached the top landing, my blood ran cold. The attic landing was covered in a thick layer of gray silt, and cutting directly through that silt were small, fresh tracks, bare feet, a child's footprints. They started from the edge of the stairwell, moved in an erratic, playful zigzag down the landing, and stopped directly at the threshold of the servants' room. The white oak door was standing open 3 inches. Driven by a desperate, irrational need to find a logical explanation, I pushed the door fully open. The room was different. The far wall was no longer solid plaster. A narrow, low opening had been crudely cut into the plasterboard, revealing the dark framework of the shared roof cavity. It looked like someone had hacked through the wall with a small knife or a chisel, and painted across the raw plaster right above the opening, in thick, dark grease crayon, were 4 words in a messy, childish scrawl. Found you. Your turn. I pulled out my heavy work torch, clicked it on, and stepped through the opening into the roof space. Logically, the space behind the plasterboard should have ended after about 15 feet. The terrace wasn't that deep, but it didn't. I crawled for what felt like several minutes. Every time I looked back, the opening behind me seemed further away. Eventually, my torch beam found the end of the joists. There was someone sitting there, a figure huddled small into the tight corner, knees pulled right up to their chin. My chest went entirely tight. The clothes were unmistakably his. A red and white striped football shirt, faded and heavily stained with decades of gray attic dust. Louis, I whispered. My voice sounded small, swallowed instantly by the insulation. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, perfectly still, facing away from me into the dark brickwork. I crawled 1 step closer, my palms pressing into the scratchy fiberglass. I tilted the torch up slightly to catch his head. His hair was long, matted, and gray with dust, but it was him. He hadn't grown. He was still 11 years old, still the exact size of the boy who went up those stairs 22 years ago. Louis, please, I said, tears blurring my vision. It's me. The game is over. Let's go home. Slowly, without a sound, the boy began to turn his head toward me. His face looked entirely normal, exactly as I remembered it from that Boxing Day night, except for one thing. His eyes were wide open, staring straight past my shoulder into the empty dark behind me, completely blank, as if he couldn't actually see me. And then he spoke. His voice sounded like a regular 11-year-old boy, but it was flat, entirely empty of emotion, like he was repeating a line he had been forced to memorize. "You took ages," he murmured. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't scream or lunge at me. Instead, he slowly shifted his weight, turning his back to me again, and squeezed himself even tighter into the narrow, dusty gap between the chimney and the roof beams. He held perfectly still, holding his breath, exactly the way we used to hide when we heard footsteps on the stairs. A cold, heavy dread settled deep in my stomach. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was just hiding, exactly the way we used to when we heard footsteps on the stairs. 22 years had passed outside that attic, but for Louis, it was still Boxing Day. I didn't say another word. I just backed out of that crawl space as fast as I could, my knees scraping against the raw timber. I didn't look back. I stumbled out of the servants' room, ran down the 3 flights of stairs into the freezing November night, and got into my car. Sometime before dawn, I noticed my watch had stopped. 2:03 a.m., the exact time I'd entered the crawl space. I remembered then that Granddad had always kept that room locked. Nobody in the family ever knew why. I think Granddad understood that some doors should stay locked. Louis was 11 when he opened that door. He still is. I never went back inside. I handed the keys back to the estate agent the next morning and told them to handle the rest of the clearance. The house was demolished 3 weeks later. A few nights ago on Christmas Eve, I woke up at exactly 3 minutes past midnight to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. It was an unknown number. I didn't answer. It went to voicemail. When I played it back, there was only silence. Then I heard the muffled sound of a child holding his breath, and Louis whispering, "Shh, don't move. There's room for one more." I haven't slept in my bedroom since.